Getting into competitive colleges is becoming increasingly difficult, and Ivy League schools are amongst the hardest to get into. Their reputation for delivering a world-class education paired with their exceptional student resources and name recognition make them some of the most selective schools in the United States, if not the entire world. Keep in mind that attending an Ivy League school isn't right for everyone, but for those who are interested in attending one, stay tuned for some of our top tips. What are selective schools looking for? Before we get started, I want to make a quick clarification. What I talk about today doesn't only apply to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and the other 5 Ivy League schools. We're really talking about all selective colleges. Selective colleges are schools where the admissions process isn't only based on an academic cutoff. These are generally the top 75 universities and top 50 liberal arts colleges. You might be wondering what selective schools are looking for in the admissions process. The first thing to know is that selective schools want their alums to go out into the world and do big things that make the school more famous. They want them to become prominent professors and academics, successful business people, international and domestic political leaders, renowned artists and cultural icons, or innovative scientists. So the big question in the admissions process is who is the most likely to become one of those successful alums someday? To understand how admissions committees make their decisions, it's important to know this guiding principle about selective college admissions. Colleges want to build a well-rounded class filled with individuals with unique interests and talents who are likely to be successful in the future so that the college increases its prestige. When a school produces successful alums, this not only reflects well on the institution, but also usually leads to increased alumni donations. This in turn allows the school to invest even more in its facilities and resources. But how do admissions committees judge if a student will be successful? Well, it's easy. They look for the students who already are successful. Their reasoning is that students who are already the top in their field are likely to be successful in the future too. Examples of these students are an international math Olympian, the number 3 distance runner in the country, or a finalist in a national writing competition. They also look for students who are pretty good at a lot of things, but not necessarily the very best at one thing. These well-rounded students are relatively successful at whatever they try, so they'll likely be successful in the future as well. Unfortunately, there are many students who are well-rounded, so it's more difficult for these applicants to have an edge in the admissions process. We'll talk more about extracurriculars later in the video, though. First, let's go through some factors that selective colleges evaluate. Selective schools use holistic admissions, meaning they evaluate your overall profile as a candidate. These colleges will look at different factors, such as academics, extracurriculars, essays, letters of recommendation, and the interview. You see here that academics still plays the largest role in their decision-making process, but that the more human components, such as extracurriculars and essays, trail behind only slightly from that 30%. Let's go into each one of these categories in more detail. Academics include your transcript, SAT or ACT scores, and SAT subject test scores. When it comes to your transcript, admissions officers will be most interested in your GPA and in the classes you took. They want to see that you took the most challenging courses available to you and that you performed well in them. If your school offers AP classes or an IB track, you should definitely consider pursuing those classes. But if your school doesn't offer these options, you don't need to sweat it. As Princeton's admissions website notes, quote, "We consider it a promising sign when students challenge themselves with advanced courses in high school. We understand that not all secondary schools offer the same range of advanced courses, but our strongest candidates have taken full advantage of the academic opportunities available to them in their high schools." End quote. This is similar to the stance noted by Dartmouth as well. Quote, "We have no set requirements for high school courses completed. We look for students who have taken the most challenging curriculum available to them." End quote. Basically, the Ivy League is looking for students who make the most of their opportunities. This means that if some AP classes are available at your school, you should take them. One thing to know is that most selective colleges use what's known as the Academic Index, or AI. This number combines your academic achievements such as GPA, class rank, and test scores into one single metric. It allows admissions officers to compare tens of thousands of applicants at once. Unfortunately, if your AI doesn't measure up, it often means that you're cut automatically. On the flip side, a high AI won't get you into a school automatically, but it will help you progress to the next step of the process. So the best way for students to get their foot in the door is to raise their academic index, that AI. In terms of grades and GPA, the Ivies don't have a minimum GPA requirement to apply. and they don't actually release the average GPA of their accepted class. As we mentioned earlier, the important thing is to just try and earn as strong of grades as possible in as challenging of courses as possible. Unfortunately, GPAs take time to build up and change, and you might not have enough time to make a meaningful shift if you're already a senior. Luckily, there are still ways to raise your academic index. Raising your standardized test scores is one of them. To know whether your score is competitive for an Ivy League school that you're looking to attend, look at the middle 50% ranges for the schools. Let's take a look at Princeton's as an example. For Princeton, the middle 50% of SAT scores amongst their accepted class is 1430 through 1560, or 32 to 35 on the ACT. Does this mean you definitely won't get in if you score below these thresholds? Absolutely not. In fact, remember that 1 out of 4 accepted students actually scored below those levels. Not bad odds. Princeton breaks down SAT statistics even further, revealing that 1.2% of students who scored between 1100 and 1250 were actually admitted, which isn't too shabby considering that their overall acceptance rate tends to be less than 6%. If your SAT scores are below the 25th percentile of admitted students at an Ivy League school, you can still get in, but you'll need to really impress the admissions committee in other ways. This leads us to the next most important component of your application, which are extracurriculars. You might be wondering how admissions committees evaluate something that are as subjective as extracurricular activities. Well, there's actually a pretty handy system to help you understand what impression your extracurricular profile might leave. Activities are usually sorted into 4 different categories called tiers. Tier 1 activities are the most impressive and usually involve significant achievement or leadership, often at a national level. An example of a Tier 1 activity would be winning a national debate competition. Now, most students don't have Tier 1 activities, but it can be a huge boost to your application if you do. As we move down the tiers, Tier 2 activities are also significant accomplishments, such as serving as the student body president or making all-state orchestra. Tier 3 activities still involve some leadership, but are a little bit more common, such as being a varsity athlete. And then Tier 4 activities are those extracurriculars in which you participated, but you didn't hold a leadership role, such as playing in the school band or volunteering in a community service club. A common misconception is that Tier 4 activities are somehow bad or looked down upon, but that's certainly not the case. While most competitive applicants should look to have significant Tier 2 or Tier 3 activities, and Tier 1 is even better, Tier 4 activities are still valuable in showing your interests and values. When it comes to activities, the more interesting the activity and the higher the tier, the better. If you have an unconventional and impressive activity, such as founding a movie blog with 100,000 monthly readers, be sure to highlight that. Another way to make your profile stand out is to create juxtapositional depth, or 2 developed areas of interest in disparate fields. Many applicants will be well-rounded, as we mentioned before, or they'll be super specialized. So those with unusual interest combinations are really likely to catch an admissions officer's eye. It's even better if you can combine these interests in an unexpected way. An example of juxtapositional depth is a student who is both a talented jazz musician and a scientific researcher. Perhaps the student even dreams of researching how music could be used as therapy. Now let's talk about essays, which make up another 25% of the application. The essays are another great opportunity to set yourself apart as a strong applicant, and at the Ivy Leagues, they become even more central to your application. Each school is looking for something a little different based on its culture. UChicago, for instance, really values creative thinking and kind of quirkiness that comes through the essays. But regardless of the school, a strong college essay always has a cohesive theme, is deeply introspective and personal, and is engaging and compelling. The essay section is unfortunately where many otherwise qualified students fall short. They're simply not used to producing the kinds of creative storytelling pieces that make for strong college essays. To make your essay as engaging as possible, you should focus on showing, not just telling. You've likely heard this advice in your English class already, but it's especially important for creative writing, such as your application essays. Here's an example of telling. I've always loved art history. On the weekends, I like to go to museums and visit old paintings and sculptures. I'm fascinated by how much the art that someone creates can tell you about their life. When I look at Van Gogh's painting, I love to imagine him sitting down and actually creating it. That excerpt I read was very straightforward, and we don't really understand what the writer feels. They're just telling us a bunch of different facts. Now here's a better example of showing in an essay. For a second, I saw Van Gogh dipping his paintbrush into the pigments on his palette, each bristle becoming draped in a swirl of bright yellow. His hands moved carefully yet quickly as he covered the canvas with dots and dashes. Whack, the red-headed artist vanished. One of the many other museum visitors bumped into me and I came crashing back into 2019. This example actually brings us to the moment the author is experiencing and helps us understand how mesmerized they are by Van Gogh. Sharing this moment is not only more engaging, but it's also a much more intimate look at the author's life and feelings about art. The essay is one of the most nuanced components of the applications process, and we unfortunately don't have time to go through it in this video all the way. For more essay advice, you can check out some of our top tips for essays in the blog post that we've linked below this video. Moving on to letters of recommendation. Another way that the admissions committee gains insight into who you are as a person and student is through your letters of recommendation. Great college recommendation letters will give an admissions officer additional information about your high school achievements and offer a better sense of who you are and how you go about achieving your goals from the perspective of another person. Most schools require 2 teacher recommendations and 1 counselor recommendation. It's best to request these letters during the spring semester of your junior year of high school. At this point, next year's applications will not have been released, but at least your recommender can get started thinking about what to say, and they'll have the summer to put together an awesome draft. The majority of students won't request these letters until the fall, so if you ask for them in the spring, your recommender will have more time to focus on you specifically. At the very least, though, ask 1 month before your first deadline. Many students have trouble deciding which teachers to ask for recommendations, so here's our advice. First, ask teachers who know you well, who you've been taught by recently, and, if you can, those who know you outside of the classroom as well, either from coaching a sport or a club. Also try to ask teachers in 2 different disciplines, such as 1 STEM teacher and 1 humanities teacher. It isn't always possible to check all these boxes, so remember that the main goal is to ask teachers who know you well, can speak positively of your academic prowess and your personal qualities. You generally want to ask teachers whose classes you aced, but asking a teacher whose class was challenging for you can also make a strong recommendation. You just want to make sure that you demonstrated perseverance and ultimately overcame the challenge that you had in that class. Some teachers may ask you to provide them with a brag sheet, or basically a resume of your extracurriculars and honors. Your counselor will also likely ask for one to write their recommendation, so it's good to have that ready for whoever might ask for it. Some students believe that they should submit extra recommendations to boost their application, but we actually recommend against that. Admissions committees are already overwhelmed with materials, so if you submit an extra recommendation that really only repeats what the other recs already stated, they might consider it a negative factor in your application. The exception, of course, is if you know a non-academic mentor, such as a coach or religious leader, who can provide extra insight into your profile. In sum, you should always submit extra materials judiciously. Lastly, let's talk about when to apply. If you're really set on attending the Ivies, you should know that your chances are better if you apply in early decision or early action. While it's true that early decision applicants tend to be a more qualified pool than regular decision applicants, our data indicates that even when corrected for differences in GPA and test scores, early decision applicants are still accepted at a higher rate than regular decision applicants. This is usually because early decision applicants are a sure thing for colleges, many of which want to accurately predict their yield. Essentially, yield is the percent of accepted students who end up actually enrolling at the college. Not only is yield an important factor to predict accurately for financial purposes, since a full class obviously brings in more tuition, but it's also weighed by many college ranking systems, and a higher yield ultimately makes an institution look more desirable. Take a look at the early decision acceptance rates compared to regular decision acceptance rates at the Ivy League schools. As you can see, early round acceptances at the Ivies are almost uniformly twice, if not 3 times, the regular decision acceptance rate. If you want to attend an Ivy, the #1 thing you can do to improve your chances is to apply early. I hope that this video has provided you with a few more tools that you need to maximize your shot at getting into the Ivy League. For more tips and tricks, check out our blog at blog.collegevine.com and our webinar about getting into Ivy League schools, which is linked below. Best of luck!